crowded boarding gate at Denver International Airport buzzed with a mix of conversations, impatient sighs, and rolling suitcase wheels. Among the sea of passengers stood Staff Sergeant Caleb Jackson, a tall, muscular black man in his mid-30s. Wearing his neatly pressed military uniform, Caleb exuded both confidence and humility. He was returning home after a grueling 6-month deployment overseas. In the same waiting area stood Margaret Bennett, a well-dressed woman in her late 30s. With her pearl necklace, designer handbag, and impeccably styled hair, she embodied the picture of upper-class privilege. She glanced over at Caleb, her lips pursing slightly. She turned to her husband, Harold, who was immersed in his phone. "Harold, would you look at that?" Margaret whispered, her tone dripping with disdain. "A man like that traveling first class. I thought they had standards." Harold barely looked up, muttering, "Margaret, not now," but Margaret's annoyance simmered. When the boarding call for first class was announced, Caleb walked confidently toward the gate, his boarding pass in hand. Margaret, also traveling first class, audibly scoffed. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for those around her to hear. Once on the plane, Margaret found her seat, 2A by the window. As fate would have it, Caleb's assigned seat was 2B, right next to hers. Margaret stiffened immediately, her eyes narrowing as he placed his carry-on in the overhead bin. "Excuse me," she said sharply, tapping the flight attendant's arm. "There must be some mistake. I paid for a first-class ticket." The flight attendant, a young woman with a polite but firm demeanor, glanced at Margaret's ticket. "Yes, ma'am. This is your seat." Margaret pointed at Caleb. "Then why is he sitting here?" The flight attendant's smile faltered. "He also has a first-class ticket." Margaret leaned back, crossing her arms with an exaggerated huff. As Caleb settled into his seat, he offered her a polite nod. "Ma'am," he said, his deep voice calm, "if I'm causing you any discomfort—" "I don't need your politeness," she snapped. "I just don't understand why someone like you thinks you belong here." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He'd dealt with people like her before. As the flight progressed, Margaret continued her passive-aggressive behavior. She refused to make eye contact with Caleb, loudly asked the flight attendant for a different seat, and even muttered under her breath about people not knowing their place. When the in-flight meal service began, Margaret pointedly asked the flight attendant, "Are we sure everyone here has actually paid for their ticket?" The flight attendant's cheeks reddened with embarrassment, but before she could respond, Caleb spoke up. "Ma'am," he said quietly but firmly, "I paid for this seat the same way you did. And I've spent the last 6 months risking my life so people like you can have the freedom to travel wherever they want." Margaret's face turned red, but she remained silent. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The plane landed in Atlanta late in the evening. Margaret hurried off, eager to leave the uncomfortable situation behind. Caleb, meanwhile, retrieved his bag and quietly exited the plane. The next morning, Margaret's routine began as usual. She sipped her coffee and flipped through the morning news on TV. But her heart stopped when she saw Caleb's face on the screen. The headline read, "Black Soldier Saves Civilians in Afghanistan Bombing." The reporter's voice narrated Caleb's heroic actions. Staff Sergeant Caleb Jackson is credited with saving the lives of 15 civilians during a bombing in Kabul. Despite being injured in the explosion, Jackson carried 2 children to safety and administered first aid to others until help arrived. The segment transitioned to an interview with Caleb. Sitting in his uniform, his arm in a sling, Caleb humbly recounted the events. "I was just doing my job," he said. "Those people needed help and I was in a position to give it." Margaret's coffee cup clattered onto the table. Her chest tightened as the reporter continued, describing Caleb's distinguished military career, numerous awards, and dedication to community service. Margaret sat frozen, shame washing over her. She recalled her cruel words, the disdain in her voice, the way she dismissed him. How could she have been so blind? As the day went on, Margaret couldn't shake the guilt. She wanted to apologize, but she had no way of contacting Caleb. The realization haunted her, and for the first time in her life, Margaret began to question the prejudices she'd carried for so long. The story stayed with her, a stark reminder of her mistake. Margaret would never forget Caleb's quiet dignity, nor the lessons he'd taught her without even trying. That night, Margaret found herself restless, tossing and turning in her bed. Caleb's calm, dignified face kept flashing in her mind. His words echoed louder than the news report. "I've spent the last 6 months risking my life so people like you can have the freedom to travel wherever they want." The truth in those words burned her, each syllable unraveling her sense of superiority. She decided she couldn't live with the weight of her actions. Determined to make amends, Margaret began searching for ways to reach Caleb. She scoured news articles about him, piecing together details about his military base and any public events he might attend. Finally, she discovered a lead. A charity gala honoring military personnel scheduled for the following week. Caleb's name was listed among the honorees. Margaret hesitated. Was it appropriate to show up uninvited? What if he didn't want to see her? Despite her doubts, she resolved to go. This wasn't about her comfort, it was about making things right. The night of the gala, Margaret stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down her dress. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't sure what she'd say to Caleb, but she knew she had to face him. The ballroom was lavishly decorated, with crystal chandeliers and patriotic banners draped across the walls. Military personnel, their families, and supporters mingled, sharing stories and laughter. Margaret felt out of place, her usual composure faltering in the face of such camaraderie. She spotted Caleb across the room, standing with a small group of people. He looked even taller and more imposing in his formal uniform. A medal gleamed on his chest, catching the light as he laughed at something someone said. Margaret's throat tightened. She took a deep breath and approached him. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling. Caleb turned to her, his expression polite but guarded. "Yes," he asked. Margaret's hands fidgeted with her clutch. I don't know if you remember me. We were on the same flight from Denver to Atlanta last week." Recognition flickered in Caleb's eyes. His posture stiffened slightly, but he remained calm. "I remember." Margaret swallowed hard. "I came here tonight because I owe you an apology. The way I acted on that plane was unacceptable. I was cruel, ignorant, and just plain wrong. I've spent the last few days ashamed of myself, and I needed to tell you that I'm sorry." The group around Caleb had fallen silent, their eyes shifting between the two. Caleb studied Margaret for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But I hope you understand that it's not just about me. The things you said weren't just hurtful to me. They're part of a larger problem. People like me, people who look like me, face that kind of treatment all the time. It's exhausting, it's unfair, and it needs to change." Margaret nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're absolutely right. I can't undo what I said, but I want to do better. I want to learn, and I want to thank you, not just for your forgiveness, but for your service. You're a better person than I deserved on that plane." Caleb's expression softened slightly. Change starts with acknowledging the problem. If you're serious about doing better, then that's a step in the right direction. Margaret left the gala feeling lighter but profoundly changed. The experience forced her to confront not only her actions but the biases she had carried her entire life. She began volunteering with organizations that supported veterans and worked toward fostering racial equality, determined to back her words with action. As for Caleb, he continued his life with the same quiet strength and dedication. He didn't dwell on the incident, but he appreciated that, for once, his dignity and composure had opened someone's eyes. Though their paths didn't cross again, the impact of their brief encounter rippled outward, leaving a mark on both their lives. Caleb remained a symbol of resilience, and Margaret, a woman humbled by her own mistakes, became a testament to the power of reflection and change. Months passed since the gala, and Margaret's transformation began to show in ways that surprised even her closest friends. She had taken Caleb's words to heart, devoting herself to unlearning the prejudices she had unknowingly nurtured for decades. Margaret joined diversity workshops, attended seminars about systemic racism, and even began mentoring young people from underprivileged backgrounds. For the first time, she was seeing the world through a lens she had ignored for so long. One evening, while reading an article about veterans reintegrating into civilian life, Margaret's thoughts wandered back to Caleb. Despite their brief encounter, his presence had left an indelible mark on her. She wondered how he was doing and whether he knew just how much he had influenced her. Meanwhile, Caleb's life had taken an unexpected turn. Recognized nationally for his heroism, he was invited to speak at various events. His humble nature made him an inspiring speaker, and his stories resonated with audiences of all ages and backgrounds. Despite the accolades, Caleb remained focused on what mattered most to him, advocating for his fellow soldiers and addressing the challenges they faced. particularly those of minority veterans who often felt invisible in the system. One day, Caleb received an invitation to a leadership summit focused on bridging divides across communities. The summit, held in Washington, D.C., would feature a diverse panel of speakers, including activists, business leaders, and military personnel. Caleb, hesitant about stepping further into the spotlight, almost declined. But after some encouragement from his commanding officer, he decided to attend. The summit was abuzz with energy. Attendees filled the grand conference hall, eager to hear from the panelists. Margaret, now actively involved in social justice initiatives, was among the audience. She hadn't expected to see Caleb listed as one of the speakers, and her heart raced at the thought of hearing him speak again. When Caleb took the stage, the room fell silent. He began by recounting his experiences in the military and the lessons he had learned about courage, perseverance, and empathy. Then, his tone shifted, and he spoke about the everyday battles many people face, those that don't involve weapons or combat zones. Sometimes, Caleb said, his deep voice resonating through the room, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. They're the battles against prejudice, ignorance, and fear. And those battles don't just affect individuals, they shape our society. Margaret felt her chest tighten. His words were cutting through her like they had on the plane, but this time, they landed differently. She was no longer defensive or blind to their meaning. Instead, she felt proud. Proud that she had taken the first steps toward change, and humbled that Caleb's wisdom had been the catalyst. After the panel ended, a line of people formed, waiting to shake Caleb's hand or thank him for his service. Margaret hesitated, unsure if approaching him again would be appropriate. But as the crowd thinned, she found herself walking toward him. "Sergeant Jackson," she said softly. Caleb turned, his expression neutral until recognition flickered across his face. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, surprised but polite. "I didn't know you'd be here," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I came to learn, but seeing you again feels... well, it feels like fate." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady. "What brings you to a summit like this?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke with honesty. "You do. That day on the plane, you forced me to look in the mirror and see a person I didn't like. I've been working to change that person ever since. I'm here because I want to be part of the solution." Caleb studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong and even more to change. I respect that." Margaret shook his hand, gratitude swelling in her chest. "Thank you for everything. You changed my life more than you'll ever know." Caleb gave her a small smile. "Then I'd say we're even. Because hearing this, it reminds me why I keep fighting." Their exchange was brief, but it symbolized a turning point in both their journeys. Margaret continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose, while Caleb's advocacy efforts grew stronger, bolstered by the knowledge that his actions, on and off the battlefield, were making a difference. Though their lives led them in different directions, their paths had crossed for a reason, leaving both of them forever changed. A year later, Margaret stood on a stage herself. She had been invited to speak at a local event honoring community leaders who had made significant contributions to promoting racial equality. Her journey from ignorance to advocacy had inspired many, and she was now a respected voice in her community. As she spoke about her transformation, Margaret's voice trembled with emotion. "Change is never easy," she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "But it starts with a single moment of truth. For me, that moment came when I met someone who had every reason to hate me but chose grace instead. That person taught me that it's never too late to unlearn hatred and replace it with understanding." After the event, Margaret mingled with the crowd, receiving warm congratulations. As she turned to leave, a familiar figure approached her. It was Caleb, dressed in his sharp military uniform, a subtle smile on his face. "Sergeant Jackson," Margaret exclaimed, surprised and delighted. "What are you doing here?" Caleb chuckled. "I heard about the event and thought I'd drop by. I wanted to see for myself what you've been up to." Margaret's cheeks flushed with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I'm so glad you came. None of this would have happened without you." Caleb shook his head. "You give me too much credit. The real work came from you. I just gave you a push." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening. "Still, I'll never forget what you said to me. You changed my life." Caleb's expression softened. "And you've paid it forward. That's what it's all about." As the event wound down, Margaret and Caleb shared a quiet moment, reflecting on how far they'd both come. Margaret no longer saw the world through the narrow lens she once did, and Caleb, ever humble, continued to inspire others with his strength and compassion. Their encounter on the plane had been brief, but its impact was lasting. Margaret carried Caleb's lessons with her every day, and Caleb found hope in knowing that even the smallest acts of courage could ripple outward, changing hearts and minds. In the end, their lives were testaments to the power of accountability, forgiveness, and the belief that no one is beyond redemption. And though their paths diverged once more, the bond they had formed, born out of conflict and transformed into mutual respect, remained unbroken. The world didn't change overnight, but for Margaret and Caleb, their shared story proved that change was always possible, one person at a time. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where someone's perspective completely changed? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more powerful and emotional narratives, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more impactful stories that will inspire, challenge, and move you. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos.